Hello, and thank you for joining me again as I read my book, Revelation. When the sisters arrived at the Woolwich dockyard, two young dockhands unloaded their buggy into a small pull cart, and they followed Sandra and Jeanette up to the ship. Jeanette tripped a few times on the long cape that she was wearing, and Sandra tried not to giggle at her sister. The ship was called the Teutonic. It has rooms for 300 first-class passengers in spacious cabins situated on the uppermost three decks. Many of the cabins were interconnecting for family travel. Second class, also known as cabin class, was designed as being in between first class and third class, meant for travelers of the middle class. Teutonic was built to carry 190 second-class passengers in comfortable rooms on the second highest, further aft towards the stern. Third class was built for immigrants and lower-class travelers. The ship could hold 1,000 third-class passengers in two areas of accommodation aboard the ship. In the bow, there were large multi-berth rooms for single men. Meanwhile, there were accommodations for the remainder of the passengers in the stern. There were small 2 and 4 berth rooms for married couples with children or for passengers with children, while single women were berthed like the men in the bow in large multi-berth dormitory-like rooms. Sandra had procured one of the small 2-berth rooms for herself and her sister. She had already had a few boxes of food delivered to the room, so she would not have to leave Jeanette for long periods of time while they were at sea. Sandra hoped that Jeanette would be able to walk around the ship at night so as not to cause any disturbances. Jeanette hurried into the room, hoping that some distance from the people would help her from wanting to tear them open and drink them dry. After the cabin boy left the room, Sandra fixed another of her special drinks for Jeanette. As she drank the concoction, she could hear what sounded like a million voices in her head slowly start to dissipate. She hoped that she would be able to get used to all of these new things that were happening to her. She felt so bad for ruining her sister's life. She'd hoped that one day she would be able to somehow repay her for the sacrifices that she had made for her. Jeanette began to feel the effects of the drink and started to relax. Sandra washed up and brushed her hair. "I have a few errands to run, Jeanette," Sandra told her as she put on her bonnet. "I think that you'll be all right here on your own for a little while." "I'll be all right, Sandra," Jeanette replied with a little sadness. "I forgot that you have to eat real food. Will you bring me an apple?" "Okay, remember, you have to eat too, sister," Sandra told her as she walked out of the door. Jeanette heard her sister lock the door with a padlock. It hurt her feelings a little to know that a sister felt that she could not be trusted on her own. Sandra had put a spell on the padlock earlier, so she could not break down the door. Jeanette tried to settle in by reading her Bible and writing in her journal. She had been keeping a journal since her mother passed. It helped her to remember her mother and her father. She wrote about the horrible mess that she was now in. Jeanette also wrote about her uncle, Garrison, and Sandra being a white witch. After about 20 minutes, she heard something outside of the room, a large noise like crates being knocked over just outside of her door. And then she heard laughter that sounded like children. She yelled out in her best man's voice, "Hey, kids, you best get out of here before I call the captain." The little girl jumped and screamed, not expecting anyone to be in a locked room. "Jimmy, we better leave, or he's going to call the captain on us, and Mom will surely tan our hides," Sarah recommended. "Wait, Sarah," Jimmy yelled back as he got closer to the locked door. "What are you doing out here?" Jeanette required. "Nothing. It was an accident." "Maybe we will tell on you," Jimmy yelled back. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Jeanette replied, still in a deep voice. "Why not?" Jimmy asked. "I'm in here watching over some very important supplies, so you best be moving along." "Come on, Jimmy. He's going to tell on us," Sarah told her brother. Jimmy yelled, "Hey, what's your name?" "My name?" Jeanette asked. "Why do you need to know my name?" "So I can tell the captain that you scared us," Jimmy sassily replied. Jeanette thinks to herself, "Well, I have to keep him from telling anyone that might come here and ask why my sister's keeping me in a locked room." "Hey, Jimmy, that's your name, right?" she asked. "Yes," he replied, trying to act like he wasn't scared. "If you and your sister promise to be good for the rest of the journey, I won't tell your mother about you sneaking around the ship," Jeanette suggested. Jimmy looked at Sarah, shaking his head up and down, as he replied, "Deal. Okay, then. Be on your way," Jeanette said firmly. Blackwood Manor. Alexander entered the dungeon as three younger vampires followed him. He walked over to a woman. Well, it was a woman, very long ago. She is chained to the floor with a silver collar and ankle cuffs. Almost all of her hair has fallen out and is lying on the ground all around her. She is wearing a faded and tattered uniform and is not wearing any shoes. Her fingernails and her toenails are long and grotesque. Above her in the ceiling are holes carved out so to let small amounts of sunlight shine down in a circle all around her. Sitting on the floor just out of her reach in front of her is a small boy. The woman is softly begging and reaching out for him. Alexander walked up to her as one of the younger vampires set a chair down next to the boy. "You may go now, my child," he told the boy. The boy got up and was led off by another young vampire. Alexander sat down. "So how are you feeling today, Sonia?" "Please kill me, Alex," Sonia begged. "So you feel that I should forget what you did?" Alexander replied. "I know that you will never forgive me for what happened," she softly answered. "Well, then I will never let you die. I like watching you suffer, and this shall continue as long as I shall live," he replied with an evil laugh. "Every time that I come to visit you, it helps me realize that I'm still the leader of this coven. I will never have my beautiful Abigail back, but I will always have you." Sonia dropped her head and wished for death as she remembered what happened to put her in this awful place. Abigail's death. When Garrison was 2 years old, Sonia was his nanny. Garrison was different than most vampires, for he was born a vampire. His mother was human when she married Alexander. It was very rare for this to happen. There had only been 22 human birthings of a vampire in and living through it on record. Alexander loved his wife and would do anything for her. He always had someone with his wife to protect her from their son. One afternoon, after tending the rose garden, Abigail was very tired. They had a gardener, Warren, but he would leave the roses in front of the nursery windows for Abigail because she loved being outside in the sunshine. While Alexander and Anthony were away on business, Abigail wanted to spend a little time with Garrison before he took his nap. When she walked into his room, she was saddened to see him covered in blood again. Sonia was cleaning up the mess of yet another family pet. Abigail told her to take the dead animal to Warren to bury. Sonia felt it would be okay to leave her for just a few minutes because Garrison had just eaten. While she was gone, Garrison bit his mother on the arm while she was changing his bloody clothes. Abigail covered her bite and hid it from Sonia. She knew that her husband would be furious, and she did not want anyone to suffer because of her. Garrison was too young to understand that he could hurt his mother. Abigail picked him up and walked over to the window and sat in the rocking chair that Alexander had made for her. As she rocked, she sang to him. Sonia returned and supervised as Abigail continued to rock Garrison. As she gazed at her son with love in her eyes, he reached up and played with his mother's hair. She took his tiny hand and gently stroked it across her cheek. When he fell asleep, Abigail kissed his cheek and put him to bed. One night later, Alexander could sense something was wrong. Because Garrison was born a vampire, Alexander could not see what his son had done. He was in Saudi Arabia and rushed back to Blackwood Manor as fast as he could. Abigail snuck out of the mansion and went into town and attacked the man and killed him. She tried to hide, but a mob chased her down and put a stake through her heart. Alexander went crazy with anger. He blamed Sonia for leaving Abigail alone with Garrison. Sonia had been in the dungeon ever since. Alexander has never gotten over her death. Watching Garrison grow up did make it easier. He took after his mother in so many ways. Garrison was a little too kind-hearted, and a quality that his father had a love-hate relationship with. Even after all this time, Alexander still regretted that he did not get back in time to help her through her transition. All vampires are supposed to go through a ritual. This helps the new vampire understand the changes they're going through. Their makers are the ones that help them through this transition. Alexander brands each of his vampires with his insignia ring, a round circle with a B in the middle. The brand is placed on the other side of the right wrist. All vampires must obey their maker. Each coven has their own set of rules, and Alexander ran Blackwood with an iron fist. No one in his coven dared to disobey him. Back to the Teutonic. Sandra returned to find her sister pacing around the bed and could tell that Jeanette was antsy to get out of the room. She fixed Jeanette another of her special drinks. She drank the whole thing down in only seconds. Sandra took a brush out of the bag and walked over and sat down beside her sister and began to brush her hair. Jeanette really loved it. Their mother, Joyce, would brush her hair when she was young, and it helped calm her down. Sandra started to do this for her after their mother died. She realized that Jeanette could not stay locked up in their room for the entire trip. "We are going for a walk." Jeanette stood up. "Do you think that I'm ready?" she wearily asked. Sandra walked over to her sister with the cloak and helped her put it on. "I hope that you are, Jeanette," and she opened the door. Jeanette walked out behind her sister, holding on to the back of her sister's dress, with her head hung low. As they worked their way through the people, she tried not to listen to everyone's blood pulsing through their veins. They walked up a small set of stairs until they reached a promenade deck. Once they were topside, they walked about halfway across the ship when Sandra stopped and pointed to an open door. "I want you to see this, sister," Sandra said as she and Jeanette walked into the large room. Jeanette lowered her hood and looked around, and she smiled when she realized that it was the library. It was filled with bookcases, a wonderful collection of the best works ever published. Sandra explained to Jeanette about how almost half of the books in the library came from their bookstore, and an older woman overheard Sandra talking to her sister. "Excuse me, are you Thomas Shaw's daughters?" she asked them. They both nodded their heads as they looked at each other. "Well, hello. I'm Kathy Ann Gables." As she reached out for Jeanette's hand, Sandra hurriedly grabbed Kathy's hand and replied, "Very nice to meet you, Miss Gables. My name is Sandra, and this is my sister Jeanette." "You both look just like your father," Kathy explained. They both smiled and said thank you. Uh, Miss Gables held out her hand as she said, "Come and look around at what your father helped us do." Kathy stepped aside as she smiled. I want to say thank you for joining me again as I read some of my